Thank you, Alan, and your colleagues for presenting to the Good Friday Agreement Committee today. Indeed, it is timely for us to examine the interim report produced by your working group on the unification referendums on the island of Ireland. And the work that you have done on the technical and the procedural matters arising from the explicit provision within the Good Friday Agreement is an important component of the global and the national discussions that are currently taking place on a daily basis. Now, I understand the work was funded by the British Academy and the Joseph Browntree Foundation. And so just my first question might be in terms of who commissioned the work. Was it the working group in itself? Maybe just to explain the context to us of that. If I ask a couple of questions, then maybe I can get a couple of answers together, and then one of my colleagues may wish to come in for the part of the 10 minutes as well. The first thing I think that's very interesting is that you address is around the democratic threshold. Since the vote in favour of unity and the vote in favour of maintaining the status quo are equally valid, that the only fair and reasonable way outworkings of it is that it would be 50% plus one, and that would then demonstrate a successful outcome for either side. So I take it that is a given now. It's 50% plus one, because some of the conversations, there's some ambiguity around that in some of the discussions that have taken place. So I might ask you just to speak to that. The other thing that really comes through in terms of your report, your substantial interim report, is the need for the Irish government to plan. Now, the Good Friday Agreement states that it's for the people of Ireland to decide without external impediment, and this implies to neutrality of the British government. But the Irish government is permitted and indeed obliged to pursue the constitutional goal of the reunification in accordance with Bunreacht na hÉireann and the Good Friday Agreement as it was. And we've seen the outcomes of the working of the referendum held without proper planning in terms of the Brexit referendum. And we know, I think everybody absolutely agrees the need to plan. So I think you referred within your report as well to the need for a constitutional assembly. Maybe if you could speak to that as well, or a civic assembly, to be able to discuss all of the issues that you raised pertaining to the unity debate and as well what the shared island unit could do. So maybe just to those three things in terms of who commissioned the report, the democratic threshold, and the need to plan, and the obligations, the constitutional obligations on the Irish government to plan, and how important you think a citizens' assembly would be. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead. Yep.
Thank you very much. I'll reply to certainly the first two and maybe say something about the third as well, but I'm sure my colleagues will want to come in on the third. So on the first question about the origins of this work, we weren't commissioned by anyone. So this was an independent academic research project in its origins. We came to the view that it was important to investigate these questions. At the Constitution Unit, we've been doing a lot of work for some years now on the appropriate conduct rules for referendums. And we had not applied that work to Northern Ireland. We recognised that Northern Ireland is a very particular case with its own particular sensitivities, and we wanted to contribute in this important area. And when we reached out to colleagues in Belfast and Dublin, we saw that there was agreement on the importance of these questions and the need to approach them in a careful, scholarly way. So that was the origin of the project. On the threshold and the referendums, yes, we're very clear in the report that the threshold in each referendum, North and South, would be a simple majority of 50% plus one. That is partly because that's what the agreement says, and it is important to follow the agreement. It's partly also because even in the absence of that existing constraint, if you like, to have any other threshold would create an inequality between the two sides, and it is imperative, we think, in a question such as this, a basic question of sovereignty, that the two sides be treated equally. So we think it's very important that the 50% plus one threshold be applied. With regard to planning, so we talk about two kinds of planning, if you like. One is planning of the process of the referendums themselves, and one is planning in relation to the form that a united Ireland might take. We recognise, as I said in my introductory remarks, that the question of when planning should take place and exactly what planning should be done by whom is a very sensitive matter, and we don't seek to make bold pronouncements on those kinds of details. What we do say is that by the time any referendum is called, it should be clear what the process will be. So a referendum should not be called unless it is clear what the processes of the referendums would be, what the timetable would be, what process would follow a vote for unification, or indeed a vote against unification. With regard to planning of the form of a united Ireland, there are various different ways in which these referendums could be configured. There's one approach that could be taken where the referendums are held with no prior planning at all. We think that's a bad idea, very clearly. A second approach would be to have a plan for a process that would be followed in the event of a vote for unification for working out the form of a united Ireland. So the form of a united Ireland would be worked out after the referendums. Or then thirdly, you could have the planning for a united Ireland done in advance of the referendums. We don't take a firm view between those two kind of final ways of running the referendums. There's a great deal that could be said about the relative merits of those, and we might get into those in the course of the questioning, but I won't attempt to go through all of that in my reply to this question. Let me just quickly say on citizens' assemblies, and then I'll hand over perhaps to David, who can comment on the constitutional issues that you raised. So I'm a big fan of citizens' assemblies. I ran the first UK-wide citizens' assembly, and a number of the other members of the working group have been intimately involved with citizens' assemblies in Ireland and Northern Ireland. So we do see an important potential role for citizens' assemblies in this process. At the same time, we urge caution. A citizens' assembly, to attempt to hold a citizens' assembly kind of too early in this process, when there isn't willingness from all parts of the community to engage with these discussions, could be damaging to the credibility of citizens' assemblies more broadly. And that would be a very unfortunate thing. So thinking through the sequencing and being careful and not going too fast into a citizens' assembly, I think, is an important point that we draw out. But let me hand over to David, perhaps.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to comment briefly on the constitutional question around Article 3, which I think is a very interesting point. Article 3 of the Irish Constitution obviously establishes something of a national aim in respect of pursuing unification. That's the way it's sometimes phrased, is setting a national aim. And the question is how that might instantiate in practical action. We, in the interim report, don't suggest that it provides a great deal of specificity. We do suggest that it would place a duty on the Irish government to hold a concurrent referendum under the Good Friday Agreement if the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland decided to call a referendum in the north. Beyond that, I think it's slightly challenging to suggest that it can place very specific duties on the Irish government to take any particular steps in respect of planning. I think that it would have to be sort of carefully worked out as a matter of politics what that constitutional duty might require. I think it's fair to say that there is at least some consequences of that constitutional duty, let's say an obligation to have a concurrent referendum, but I'd be loath to suggest it could suggest very specific action beyond that as a matter of law, though as a matter of politics, certainly that could be persuasively argued.
Okay, thanks, David.